I'm going to get started in a minute. I am Alvin Ellis Brunson. I was born on this date, August the 6th, 1918, and today is August the 6th, 2003. Well, this is what I'm leaving the world, and this is my gift for my 85th birthday, is starting to tell the story of my life as I can remember it. I was always told that I was a man of very few words, so that's what you're going to hear throughout this tape, is a few words, but you will have to hear them over and over again because, as I say, I'm a man of few words. When I was born back in Robertson County, way back in the woods, very far back in the woods, I was the son of a sharecropper, and I was the middle boy, as close to the middle as you can get of 6. And we had poor parents. They wasn't educated, they wasn't religious, but my parents didn't know right from wrong. And they taught us boys the difference between right and difference between wrong. And all of our lives they tried to teach us how to work and to make an honest living. I can't remember too much of my first years. I can remember when I was about 4, I had got me a little pistol for Christmas. At them days, that's all we ever had was one present a year. We didn't get a present every time you went to the store because there wasn't many stores to go to. But as I was going to say about my pistol, I dropped it in the horse lot and the horse stepped on it the next day after I got it. And I was really broken-hearted. And there was a little creek about 50, 75 yards from our house. And I would go fishing. I liked to fish then, I like to fish now. I would go fishing and I would take my lunch with me. I'd take a biscuit rolled up in something and I would go fishing. They wouldn't let me have a regular fish hook. They would bend a straight pin, make a crook on the end of a pin. So when I stuck it in my finger, I could pull it back out without tearing the finger up so much. And that's the way I started out my childhood that I can remember. And that same year, on my 4th birthday, I remember that day real good. My daddy was cutting wood for my mama to cook dinner with, and he got through, he'd come by where me and my brother was playing. My brother was 4 years older than me, and he said, "Son, get that wood into your mama where she can finish dinner." I looked at him, I said, "I'll get that wood in when I get good and ready." And you know something? I got ready pretty quick. And from that day forward, I had a chore of some kind that I was responsible. I was responsible for some chore every day of my life. It might not be nothing but just pick up a chip or corn cobs for my daddy to start a fire in the wood stove with, for my mama to cook breakfast. But I was responsible. And another thing I was responsible was to feed the chickens. I had to feed them chickens. And till this day, I like to see chickens eat. I've got some ducks out here now that they're not mine, but I feed them. I'll go out there and pass the time with my ducks. That's another story, and I'll get back to them later. But as time went on, I can't remember exactly the days and nights of how we did things, but we had to pick cotton in the fall, I picked cotton. I had a little bit of short sack, but I had to pick cotton. I had to be out there in the field. My mama, she worked in the field same as my daddy did. And we had a good time. We wasn't sad. We never missed anything because there wasn't anything to miss. If you don't know about something, you never miss it. We had our cats and our dogs and all that stuff, but each one of our animals had a job to do. Our dog's job was to hunt, to find squirrels and possums and things of that nature, and to keep the other varmints away from the chickens at night. And our cat, he was to catch the mice around the place, and if he didn't do this chore, he didn't stay at our house very long. And as I can best remember, that same year my grandmother passed away, I can remember standing by her bedside. She already knew she was going to die. She told me, she said, "Son, be good to your little brother, and don't hurt him or don't fight with him." And I never did. As we grew older, me and my brother, we grew apart. Of course, I had a bunch of brothers, but he and I, we never did have a relationship in our adult age. But I loved him. He loved me. But we're getting back to my 5-year-old. We moved to a place, another place. My daddy never stayed anywhere but 4 or 5 years at a time. He liked to keep moving. He didn't better himself any, but in his mind he thought he was doing better by moving. And I'm glad now as I look back on it, we didn't live in the same place all the time. We had absolutely nothing. We didn't have a refrigerator, we didn't have air conditioning, we didn't have an automobile, we didn't have a radio, we didn't have anything. All we had was just the bare necessities of life. And we ate off the land, more or less. But my daddy never made any money. He never made any money, but he worked. No sharecropper ever made any money. And I'm glad to know that I was a sharecropper. And I hadn't started school yet. But them days, kids didn't learn anything until they started school because the parents didn't teach them. Because most of the parents didn't know anything to teach them to start with. And I was trying to stay out of school. I didn't actually want to go to school because I was used to running the woods like I wanted to, except whenever I was doing my chores. And the first day I went to school, I didn't like my teacher, Atoll. Not Atoll did I like her. She'd come by, I'd kick her. First time she looked at me. And I noticed she walked on up to her desk and picked up a yardstick, and she made her rounds around the other side of the room and come up from behind me. And I kicked her. And that was when I shouldn't have kicked her. Because she jerked me out of that seat and she wore the seat off my pants with that yardstick right there for everybody. And I'll tell you, I never kicked Miss Woods again. I never was real courtesy to her, though. I would tell her things that wasn't right. One day she wrote some stuff on the board, and she said, "Alvin, do you know what this is?" I said, "Miss Woods, do you know what it is?" She said, "Certainly." I said, "What is the use for me to tell you then, because we both already know?" And there come the yardstick again. And from then on, I answered to the best of my ability. Courtesy. I was fairly courteous to the lady. But anyway, I failed that first grade because she didn't like me. I didn't like her. I didn't learn. I didn't learn is the reason I failed. I didn't fail because she didn't like me. It's just because I didn't learn, and she was doing me a great service by letting me stay in that first grade. So next year, I repeated first grade. And then we moved that year. And when we moved to another school, I skipped second grade. I went to the third grade when I got to that new school. And I made out and I passed. I could do the work, so I stayed in the third grade. It was quite a school. The people nowadays has open concept in school. That's what we had in reality. She had three grades in this one room and one teacher for 3 grades. And that was pretty neato, because by the time you got to the 4th grade, there was 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade. By the time you got to the 5th grade, you already knew it because you'd listened to the 3rd and 4th all these years. So that made it pretty nice. And then we moved again. We moved to a town that's a little bit bigger. It had one teacher for each room and about as many kids in one grade as we had in our 3 grades in the other school. And it was kind of rugged on me to get accustomed to that many people. But I learned pretty soon how to cope with a crowd, and I learned that I could also get by with a few things if I would try to say the right words with the right attitude. And I started developing the attitude of gratitude right there that I was going to make it. By that time I was getting on up about 8, 9 years old, I guess. Maybe the next thing I really remember, we moved again back to where I had been in that school with 3 grades with one teacher. But we lived way down on a creek, on Duck Creek. There was over a school called Bald Prairie. We was down on the creek one night, me and my brothers, and I got snake bit. And I hollered to my oldest brother, I said, "Steele, I'm snake bit." He said, "Get out of there before he bites you again." What he didn't know is I was already 20 foot away from where that snake was. When he hit me, I jumped that far. But we didn't have any doctors anywhere close. We were 20 miles from Franklin. And the only way we had to go was in a wagon. That was 1928. And if I was going to die, I would have died from a snake bite before I got down there anyway. So I laid at the house, and I got sick, and my foot swelled and turned black, and I had a hard time of getting over that snake bite. And then the next year, we were still at the same place. I climbed a tree, and my daddy hollered out, "Get out of that tree before I come up there and pull you out." So I jumped out and broke a foot as I jumped out of the tree. I was laid up again. Same foot, and everything went along pretty good. I was beginning to get bigger then, and I could do things. But I still fished every opportunity I got to wet a hook in any kind of water I went fishing. We stayed there that year, and the next year we moved back again, back across Navasota River, back in Leon County, and I was having to go back to that same school where I had left. And there was a lad there, me and him, we wasn't enemies. We wasn't mad with one another, but we just liked to fight. His name was Fred Brock. And any time Fred Brock and I ever got together, from the time we were in the 6th grade until we got out of high school, we was going to fight. There just wasn't no way out of it. Mostly when we quit fighting was when we began to bleed from our fights. Because if you're bleeding, it's not funny like it is just hitting one another. I remember one time we had no place to eat our lunches at school, and he was sitting on the steps of a building eating his lunch, and it was the dressing room for the boys' athletic team. And I just seen it laying there on an old dirty jock strap. I just picked it up and jerked it down over Fred's head. He didn't get up and start fighting. He just started fighting and got up. And we had ourselves a good one again. But our last fight was at a church house. It was on the New Year's night at midnight service. I started out of the church house. I was on the steps, and he was coming in, and we met on the steps. I didn't see him, but he hung one under my eye, and I went rolling down them steps. We had our fight, got up, but that was the last one we ever had. And I never seen Fred anymore. It wasn't many years. He moved on somewhere else, but a few more years he got in the Army. And he was in the Philippines during WWII. He was at the fall of Eudora. So I never seen him anymore. I talked to him once on the phone, but I never seen him. I was getting pretty big then. I was playing football. I wasn't very good, but I thought I was good. Today's standards, I wouldn't have done very good. I was a good student. I did learn. I made good grades, but life was boring out there. By that time, I began to want things. I began to see pictures in magazines of what it was like somewhere else. But we still had our horses and mules and wagons, just like we'd always had. We still didn't have an automobile. We had no radio. Some people had radios, some didn't. I played football a couple of years, and then I went. As I'm going to do right now, I'm going to do that all through the tape. I got to go back a few years, back to where about 10 years old. When I went to the mailbox to get the mail, our mail was about 2 miles from home, our box was. And inside of that box that day, they had sent us a sample package of X-Lax. Being old stupid as I was, I didn't know what an X-Light was. I opened it and it looked like chocolate candy. I say to myself, I said, my brother's not going to get any of this chocolate. This is all for me. And it was all for me. All night out long it was for me. And that's when I began to learn there was something in this world besides me. I decided I would share with other people from then on. As I went back and picked up that kind of a story, I'm going to have to do that all through here. It's going to get kind of monotonous, but it will be going back. You will get all of my life story by the time you get to the end of it. I was talking about playing football in high school. I was getting on up 16, 17 years old, and 16, I guess. And things was getting tougher around our place. It must have been about 1934 to 1935. And we didn't make any crop for 2 straight years there. We had complete crop failures. And we made nothing. And they had this program for young men at that time. It was a Civilian Conservation Corps. And I was getting old enough I could just about get in. You had to be 18, had to be 17. And the same as to get in the Army. And it paid $25 to the parents and $5 to the man that was in the Corps. So I went into the Civilian Conservation Corps. We called it the CC camps. And I was stationed up in Huntsville, Texas. Things wasn't too bad. I lived on my $5 a month, and the folks made out pretty good on their $25 a month. But I was still restless, and I still needed to go to school some more. I went to school at night while I was in that camp, and I got credit for it against the high school diploma. So when spring came, you just went into this program for 6 months at a time. I got out, and then fall I went back to high school there in Marquette, and I finished. And by this time, it was getting on up in the years, and it was 1938 then. Still wasn't any money, but I finished high school in 1939. I wanted to go to college so bad, but I just couldn't find no money to go on. It wasn't then, it wasn't like it is now. You could get all these grants and borrow from the government. At that time, you either had to have the money or you didn't go to school. And I didn't go to school. And I hicked around and kicked around as years went on by. I got older and I got more restless. And in the meantime, one year my mama broke her arm, and I had to take over her household chores. And this year I learned to cook. I become a pretty good cook at that time, and I kind of liked cooking. And when I went on, and my brothers, they were outgrowing me somewhere or another. My brother just younger than me, Walter S., I never knew him really. I knew him as an adult nor as a teenager, I never knew him. He was in the family, but somehow or another we just never had a relationship. So when I worked for my brother, we picked cotton, we made corn, and go back. Well, let me go back just a little bit, back to my brother's wedding. That was some years before that. They had already rented a little old house out there in the country to live in, and they had moved in. Everything was set up before they got married. They didn't live in the house because people didn't live together then and then get married. You had to get married and then live together. And me and her brother, my sister-in-law's brother, we caught a possum and an armadillo out in the woods, and we come and we throwed it in the house with them while they was in bed. And that didn't go over very well with the in-laws. Either one, my in-laws or his in-laws, either one. They didn't like us doing that. And I worked for them, and we had a relationship. And as times was going on, Father and I was getting older and more restless. I'd hitchhike ever so often. I'd hitchhike out to West Texas just to be going somewhere. Because I never was a person that liked to sit still. I always liked to go. I'd get out on the road and I'd hitchhike to Lubbock or somewhere, and I could make as good a time of hitchhiking them days as I could if I had a car to drive. And then there's another program come along. They called it the NYA, or the National Youth Program. It paid little money. You just worked about 15 hours, 14 hours a month, and we got about $17 a month out for that time. And that's when I learned to be a woodworker. And I did pretty good at it, and I would go to my days off from the job. I would go in the shop and work with their tools. And I accomplished quite a bit. I learned enough to set a base for the rest of my life before to make a livelihood. But I got a hernia in somewhere along the road, and it was bothering me, and I didn't have any money to have it fixed. But I went and I had an old cow. I mortgaged the old cow for $50. She wasn't worth but about $30, but the man let me have $50 because a complete operation at that time for a hernia was $50. And I had my hernia fixed. At that time, you had to stay in bed 14 days. You couldn't get up. And that was, now I was on up into 1941. And I was restless. As I've said all the time, I was real restless. And I went, whenever I was laying in bed, I had a radio. I don't know how we got it, but I had a little old radio. And the Marine Corps had went to Iceland. The 6th Marine Division had gone to Iceland. So I made up my mind that that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a Marine and go to Iceland. I didn't know what I was going to do up there, but I was just going to be getting away from Marquette in Leon County. When I got well, or over that hernia operation, I went to Waco. And there I seen a Marine sergeant with dress blues on. That was the most beautiful sight my eyeballs had ever seen, was that Marine sergeant with dress blues. It didn't take him but about 20 minutes to have me convinced that I should be a Marine. And I signed the paper and went back home waiting for them to call me. It was about a week before they called me. And when they called me, I was on my way to San Diego. I was one happy camper. I was happy. I think that was the happiest I ever been about anything up till that time. When I was sworn in Dallas on August the 12th, 1942, and my name, since my initial was B, I had the first initial in the group that was going, so he gave me the paperwork to carry on to California. I thought I had really made myself a promotion. And when we got to San Diego, everything in this world dropped down around my ears. I was the most disgusted person in the world. The language that the man used to us, he stood us up and he called us everything but a human being. And he said he didn't want us here. He didn't ask for us. And now that we was there, he said, you just better be thankful that our souls still belong to God, but everything else belongs to the Marine Corps. And he truly meant that. And the very next morning, we fell out and we went to the barber shop and they cut our hair off to the bare, just skin short. That's how short he was. And gave us clothes. Went to get clothes. They just issued you clothes off the rack as you come to it. If you was a little man, you might get big clothes. If you're a big man, you might get little clothes. The only thing they tried to fit was your shoes, because we didn't know why it was so important for the shoes. But before we got out of boot camp, we knew why it was important to have shoes, good shoes that fit. And I went many a day that I wish I had have never heard of the Marine Corps. And I was in the mess hall. I served a lot of time on mess duty, because that was kind of easy in a sense, because I just had to wash pots and pans, and I was used to washing dishes at home, so it didn't make too much difference. The one thing that I truly hated more than anything else was peeling potatoes. We'd be potatoes, about hundreds of pounds of potatoes. You'd sit there and peel potatoes for hours at a time. That was punishment job, was potato peeling. And they'd inspect you every so often and see that you wasn't cutting too much of the potato off. If you cut too much of the potato off with the skin, you had to do extra duty that night, something like washing the bathrooms out. They called them heads in the Marine Corps. Their restrooms were heads. And more than one time I've had to scrub the head with a toothbrush because I did something that I shouldn't have done during the day. And that time didn't count. I had to just go without that sleep. All this was building up to something a lot bigger than what we thought it was. It was all for a reason. And I stayed in boot camp till I got out of boot camp, and then they gave us a 10-day furlough home. And I was on the road most of the day, most of the time going home. I had 3 or 4 days at home with the folks, and before I had to go back to camp. My brother that still lived there, I told him then, I says, I won't be home until the war is over. There wasn't no war, and the average person didn't think about a war coming. But they was training us all the time, teaching us how to fight jungle warfare. So I knew that when the war was over, I'd get to come home again. But many times during that next few years, I wondered if I was ever going to go home again. And finally I got out of boot camp, and I got in another mess hall, and there's this sergeant there. He was in charge of maintenance, and he asked me, I was waiting on his table all the time. He asked me one day if I would like to be in the maintenance. So he got me transferred over to his outfit in maintenance. And me being an old country boy, I knew how to handle barbed wire. And the general needed a horse corral built. and I could handle barbed wire, so he got me on building them corrals for the general's horses, and that was pretty. I just worked as I wanted to, and he gave me a $5 a month extra pay for that, but it wasn't nothing in the book that said that I should be drawing a $5 specialist pay. If you were a clerk, you could get it, so he wrote in my record book that I was a clerk. And in every outfit I ever got into during the rest of the war, I was a clerk. And I stayed in there, till the next spring, sometime about the latter part of May. And me and a friend of mine wanted to get in a fight outfit. We just had to go. We went up to the colonel and said, asked for a transfer to the 2nd Marines because they were fixing to ship out for parts unknown in the Pacific. It didn't make us any difference what part of the Pacific we went in, because that's where the Japs was tearing everybody up, was in the Pacific. So he finally let us go. He transferred us into the 1st Regiment of the 2nd Division. We got in one day, and the next day we went aboard ship. I'd never seen a ship. That was the first ship I'd ever seen whenever I went aboard that one. And that was a great adventure. I was living high on the hog. I was moving on. But in the meantime, I had got promoted from a private to a private first class. And that gave me one little stripe on my arm. And I was real proud of that one little stripe. And we went aboard ship sometime in June, early part of June. And we stayed aboard that ship until we got off of that ship on August the 7th, 1942 in Guadalcanal. We stopped on the way at several islands. We stopped in some islands way down somewhere in the South Pacific, Tonga and Abu, and then we went on to some more islands, the Fijis, and we'd stop over. What we were doing, we were waiting for the rest of the convoy to catch up. They came off the East Coast down through the Panama Canal, and we'd went straight across the ocean. And when they got caught up to us, we taken off and we landed on Guadalcanal. I didn't land on Guadalcanal itself. I landed on a little island beside of it. But our battalion, the 1st Battalion, 2nd Marine Division, Company D and B, we were the first troops that landed in the Pacific at the beginning of the offensive in World War II against the Japs. That night, as I look back on it now, 60-something years later, that was the most hectic night you ever seen. The old land crabs was out in the bushes, and they'd make a racket, and we thought it was a Jap move, and we'd fire. I know everybody fired a unit of fire that night. Wasn't the Jap nowhere close to us, but we were shooting anyway. The next morning we loaded up and we went in where the Japs were. We landed on the island of Tulagi. We landed straight in a cemetery, and if you don't think that gives you a creepy feeling, landing in a cemetery, you have to think again. And we were there for a few days, then we went on to Guadalcanal, and we stayed there till February of 43 before we left. We had days after day, but while we was on Tulagi, it was real tough. We had no food. The Japs run our ships off that first night we were there. Everything we had to leave. And they left us ashore with no food, nothing, or what little bit we had carried ashore with us that morning. And we lived off the fat of the land. We ate tops out of coconut trees. We ate pears, and there was some sweet potatoes that grew there. They grew pretty big. And we would dig a sweet potato, and we had some buckets we cooked in. I don't know where the buckets came from. But we would boil that sweet potato in that seawater so they would be salty. And we ate. We lived. And I was always on Tulagi. I always did like to start a rumor. A lad and myself, we'd walk around the island over to the other side, and we'd start some kind of a rumor about how the war was going somewhere else and what was going on and all that kind of stuff. And then we'd come back to our area, but before we could get back, our story had beat us over there, and we didn't even recognize it had been changed so much. But stuff like that really kept us going. If it hadn't been for rumors and stuff of that nature, we would all went crazy. I'm glad today to look back on it and to know that them people was my friends. Oh yeah, that's when I started smoking cigarettes too. Up till that time I had never smoked a cigarette, only just maybe 2 or 3 puffs. In our ration, we got 2 packs a week, and I was dividing my cigarettes among the people in the squad, and there's always one man that didn't get as many cigarettes as somebody else, and they'd bitch and moan about that. And one day I said, I'll just smoke them myself. And that day I sat down and I went to smoking my 2 packs of cigarettes. I would cough, I would throw up, I would lose my breath. But I mastered that art of smoking. And for the next 44 years, I burned cigarettes. I averaged burning 2 packs of cigarettes every day for 42 years. And today I'm paying for it. I drag an oxygen bottle around with me. So any of y'all that smokes, just think about what 42 years of smoking will do for you. And I was right now is a good time to go back. As I said a long time back in this story, that I would have to go back and catch up. As I went back, as I go back now, I'll go way on back till I was a teenager. I didn't leave this out a while ago intentionally. I left it out because I was thinking about something else, but this was a pretty important time in my life. While I was restless and irritable and discontent, there was something else that came along that helped me to go through that. I thought it was really helping me a great deal. And that was alcohol. I developed a taste for alcohol at a very early age, something like 13, 14 years old. I never was a real nasty, fall-down, drunk alcoholic in my young days, but I drank that alcohol for the simple fact that it made me feel like that I was one of the others. I wasn't a poor sharecropper at that time. I was just an equal to everybody else in the crowd. And I would drink so I could be equal. And that went on till I was 27 years old when I quit again, when I quit drinking. All the time I was in the service, that was the thing that I really did the most of, was was alcoholic drinks of some kind or another. And I'm not real proud of the days that I drank alcohol, but I am grateful for them because alcohol got me in and out of places that I would have never been able to have gone to and did if I hadn't had alcohol. Because I had a great fear of people, places, and things. And without alcohol, I didn't have them people, places, and things to deal with. I was the equal. I could do whatever I wanted to, when I wanted to, and as much of it as I wanted to. But that is the one thing that I am grateful for towards alcohol. It did carry me along until I got to the point where I could live without it. I can remember doing things under the influence that I wouldn't have done at all without. Without the alcoholic influence, I would have never mastered many things that I wanted to do. I wanted to ride a bull once, and if I'd have been sober, I would have even gotten a pen with him. But while I was under the influence, I could get in that pen or that bull. I was big as he was, I thought, but I wasn't. So that's the part I needed to go back and pick up again. And I kept on that alcohol all the times through the service. In all them years, I drank because that was the end thing to do at that time. But in 1944, I came home on furlough. I came back from overseas, and I came home on furlough. And I stopped off in a little town in West Texas, Levelland, and that's where I met my wife and we had a relationship for the next 56 years. We were married 55 years, and we had a 1-year relationship before we married. But God put her into my life, and when God set her in my life, He literally set her right in my lap. There was a carload of young folks, and when she got to the car, there was no place to sit but on my lap, and that's where she landed. And praise God, she stayed there for the next 55 years. We went to Lubbock the next weekend after that, and that was the only date we ever had, was that one time. I went on back to camp, and I wrote to her for a year, and I told her a few things about me, and then I came home. We got married. We married on the way home. I never got home before we got married. I stopped off at my brother's house in Levelland, Texas, and that's where we got married, in his living room. We went to get her daddy, Mr. Brock, to go to the wedding, and he said no, he had to sleep. That was how important I was in his life, and his daughter's life too, as far as he was concerned, because he didn't think that we would ever do anything. I was a serviceman, and he thought I was just going to get what I could get and run. But I didn't do it. I fooled the old man. We lived there 8-10 months in that town. He'd go in front of the house, and he wouldn't even look towards where we were living. But as time went on by, he got to be a pretty good buddy to me. Me and him got a good relationship, which I am proud of. I'd go fishing, and he'd go along with me, and we'd do whatever he wanted to do. Me and him would do it. It didn't make me any difference. He was a sick old man and was supposed to have been on a diet. I am too right now, but I lived just like Paul Brock did. And his kids wouldn't do that. They stayed on him and aggravated him all the time about what he eat and what he shouldn't eat and how he should act. But not me, and I don't want my kids doing me that way either. And we moved to Houston then, and I went to work for an outfit. I worked down here a while. I did pretty good. It rained a lot that year. I thought this was the wettest country in the world down here. I made a lot of 4 or 5 hour weeks that year. Eudora worked in a laundry a little bit. We had a little old house we had rented out there. We paid $8 a week for house rent, and all the bills were paid. I thought that was pretty good. We saved a little bit of money, and then the next spring, well, in the meantime, she went to work for Iwiener Stores down on Jensen Drive, and I used to go down there and wait till she got off work, and then we'd either go to the movie or we'd go ride the bus back to the house because we didn't have a car. I talked to Mrs. Wiener, and she would tell me that ignorance was an asset instead of a liability to people. I thought she was making fun of me, but she wasn't. She was telling me the truth. As the years went by, I learned that what she was telling me was the truth. Because less you know, less they expect out of you. And then we moved. The next spring, we moved back to Odessa, and I went to work out there. We left Houston the same day that Texas City blew up in 1947. That was the day we was leaving Houston when we got the word that Texas City had exploded. I went to Odessa and went to work as a carpenter out there. I joined a union, got union wages, which wasn't much at that time. Our wage was $1.50 an hour when I first went out there. And I worked for a builder out of Dallas, T.C. Bates. We built schoolhouses. We built schoolhouses all over it out there. And we rented a little old apartment out there in a little rat hole place called D Court. And we lived there a while. It was cheap too. Of course, house rent didn't cost much anywhere you went then. We paid $30 a month down there at D Court for one bedroom. Well, in fact, it was almost just a one room. The living room and the bedroom was one room, and the kitchen and dining room was another room. Then we rented a little old house up there where my brother Steele lived. It was built in an alley. What it really was, it was a one-car garage that they had put a floor in and sheetrock the inside. The outside was sheet metal. And we paid $28 a month for it. But we had to share the bath with some people over in the big house, because that one didn't have a bath. It didn't have a dining table either. It had a board hinged to the wall, and if you wanted to set the table, you let the board down, and it had a leg that was under it that held the table up. And that's where we was living when our first boy was born, Sam, when Sam was first born. We had a lot of fun with that. In a sense it was fun, in a sense it wasn't fun. Eudora's sister Judy come lived with us there a while, and while Eudora was so sick with being pregnant with Sam, and we give Eudora a lot of trouble with her sickness. We thought it was fun, but it wasn't so funny after all. Then I bought me an old car that year. It was the first old car I had ever owned, and I had to do the best I could. It was an old 38 model Ford, and the quarter panels were all rusted out. You could see plumb through it from one side to the other. But I bought it, and it would run. It had a good motor in it, and I drove it for about a year. And then we sold it, I sold it for a bus fare. How come I was in the position where I was at? I went down to Brownwood to see Eudora's grandpa, Melvin Baskin. And the old man was sick. He expected him to die, everybody but him. But he told me, he said, I haven't seen California yet, and I'm going to California before I die. And that spring he got well, and that summer they drove the old Ford that I sold his son-in-law. And he drove it to California. And then then that winter, I came back to Marquette then and lived with my folks a little bit. After that, Sam was born, and we lived at this place right uptown, Marquette. And my daddy and mama lived over across the river. We stayed over there more than we stayed at home. And I did odd jobs around. I went to a little government school to get my GI Bill. It was on the GI Bill, and I went to get whatever money I could get out of it. It wasn't very much, enough to live on. And in the meantime, it come time to go to West Texas because it was bowl pulling time. I always liked to pull cotton bowls because I could pull lots of cotton. And I went out there and made some money at that time. $8, $10 a day was pretty good money at that time. And I could make it and do it as I wanted to. And then we come back and we was living in that little house there at Marquette we had rented. And we was going to rent a farm out there and farm next year. We was going to get rich raising tomatoes and watermelons. But we was over at my daddy's house one day, and this little old house burned to the ground. Nobody knows till this day what caused it to burn. They assumed that the pilot light on the stove blew out, and the pressure of the butane had built up enough to blow the pressure of the pilot light out of the stove and shot the flame all the way to the ceiling. But nobody really ever knew. But anyway, we went ahead and he rented us, that fellow rented us that farm, and we built a house up there. He paid me to work on it. I got $3 a day to work, because that's the way they paid up there. They didn't pay by the hour, they paid by the day. Whatever work you did around Marquette in the 50s, the 40s and 50s, it was by the day, not by the hour. And I didn't do too bad that first year, but during this time, Eudora had got pregnant again with our second son, John. And we was living out there on that little old farm when John was born. He was born in Franklin, I'd have to take her down there every 2 weeks there on the last of it. And on the 13th of April in 1950, I was out planting watermelons, and Judy, that's Eudora's sister, was with us before. She came over where I was planting watermelons and said I needed to take Eudora to the doctor because it was time for her to deliver. So I carried her to the doctor, and the doctor examined her and put her to bed, and he said, well, he's going to go ahead and go home and get a good night's rest because there wasn't nothing going to happen until tomorrow. So I went back up to Marquette and went to bed, and then I got laid down. I said, yeah, I expect I better go back down there to Franklin, to the hospital. So I got up and I drove back to the hospital. And sure enough, it was just about time for her to be ready. Yeah, but in the meantime, before I went home, I went to the movie. And the show that I seen that night was Battleground. It was in Bastrone when the Germans was in the breakthrough in the Battle of the Bulge. And I seen that show while she was laying over in the hospital. Till this day, when things gets real tough, I'd like to break that show out and look at it. But when I got back down there, the nurse said, I can't get a hold of the doctor, but this baby's coming, whether we got a doctor or whether we don't got a doctor. I said, what are we going to do? She said, we're just going to have to deliver him. And we laid her up on that table and strapped her down. And as long as Eudora lived, she never forgot how tight we had strapped her to that table. I knew one thing, if we were going to have to do it, I didn't want no kicking and wailing and no arms flying around. But the doctor got there just in time, and the boy was born, and that was our second son. He was all right. He didn't holler much like Sam did. Sam screamed and hollered all his life. He come in this world screaming, and he's 55 years old now, and he still screams a lot. But we was living out on the farm then when and we started feeding him cow milk. We didn't have a formula like we did for the other one. We just fed him raw cow milk, and as soon as he got big enough to eat, we'd mash up table food and feed him off the table, not baby formula like you have now. And he got along all right. He did real good. And then that year, things had began to get tough. I began to get restless again. I began to get irritable. And I wanted to go back and get with him where there's a few dollars to be made. And I went and hired out down at Bryan to the Bryan Air Base, where they was rebuilding Bryan Air Base. And I went down there and hired out and made a little money. And then from there we moved back to Level Land. And we went to Level Land, and I went to work on a place out there, the Whiteface Schoolhouse, and they didn't have the didn't have the plans drew right, and the iron came out wrong, and they had to shut that job down, so I was out of a job again. But I went and I made out pretty good. I went to work in the oil field. I went out there and I worked enough one week, I'd get enough money to leave on it. We came back to Houston. And we've been down in this area ever since. But right now, I'm going to have to go back a little to the year before that, when we were living in Leveland, and when Sam was before John was born, and things got tough. I couldn't find any carpenter work to do, and I went hired out to an outfit that was setting electric motors on pumping units in the oil field. And I didn't know anything about what them pumping units were and nothing about that. It was real cold. We'd been working for about 10, 12 hours. And we set a pump on this well, and it was hitting too many strokes a minute. We had to change the counterbalances on it for it to slow it down. And I didn't know. I had my hand all the way through, and I loosened the front bolt, and then I reached back and loosened the back bolt, and that thing slipped and it broke both my hands. And then I got my hands out just in time to keep it from bashing them off, but the fingers were all broken. And when I got over that, we came back down to Marquette and lived there for a while. I went to a GI school there in Jewett. And while I was in school there, I decided I would do something else. And I tried 2 or 3 different things, but nothing worked. Seemed like everything I did, I tried all my work, and I would try it for a while, and I'd have to get back to something else and go to carpentry. You can't believe what I'm fixing to say. I've got to go back now 4 years to the most important part of my life. It was WWII. In 1941, I joined the Marine Corps, and when I got out of boot camp, I worked in different places in the Marine Corps, did different things, but right on the end, I was in a maintenance. And as I stated way earlier in this, I got transferred out into the unit that was going overseas. And we had a lot of trouble there getting out of that maintenance into a combat unit. We got out anyway. And I don't know exactly where I was at back in the front part of this, but I do know I missed the better part of the war years. When we got through at Guadalcanal, that was in 1943, and we went back to New Zealand, and we lived in New Zealand for the next 9 months. We just felt like we had became naturalized citizens of New Zealand. The first 3 months we were there, we didn't have to do anything but go on liberty because we were all sick from jungle fever, malaria, and just anything you could think of we had. And they let us get rested up and then reformed and retrained and got to go in with this war deal again. We left there in November and we went up to Tarawa, which was a little island in the mid-Pacific. It was supposed to have been a little pushover island, but it wasn't so easy. The way it wasn't but 4 foot above sea level anywhere on the island. And when we got there, the tide was out, and the hig boats wouldn't go in over the coral reefs. And the people that wasn't lucky enough to go in alligators was had to wade that water in. An alligator was a little tractor-like deal that would run on land or in the water, either one. It would haul 2 squads of men, about 30 people. And I was fortunate enough to be transferred from a Higgins boat into an alligator out there somewhere because they needed our guns on the shore. It was, we got in about 11 o'clock on D-Day, and the advanced troops was about 20 foot off the water, and the tide was out. A lad in my squad said to another Marine that was already there, says, "How far is it to the front?" He said, "If you get in front of my rifle, you will be in front of the front." So that's what the deal we had there. That one lasted 3 days and 3 nights. It went down as one of the bloodiest battles of the Marine Corps. We lost something better than 1,000 killed there in our 3 days. You didn't know who you actually your neighbor was. The unit next to you, we were all so shot up and disoriented that we didn't know who anybody was. Everybody had got separated, and we were almost on our own. And we won that battle because it was God's will. It wasn't ours. It was God's will that we were able to defend that, to win that battle on that island. They learned a lot from that. And then after 72 hours, they put us aboard ship and we went back to Hawaii. We went over on the Big Island, where Hilo is on the Big Island. We went over on that island. We stayed there until the following spring. It wasn't so good in Hawaii because anywhere you went on the island, there were so many servicemen. It was just like being in camp all the time. When you go in to get a drink, if you were lucky enough to get into a bar, you couldn't drink unless you were sitting down. And they didn't sell many drinks because somebody sat down, they didn't get up. That's about all the liberty we had there, was just going. We had one trip around the island on a bus. We'd taken one bus trip around the island. I got pretty well drunk up as usual them days. That was one of my main things to do, was to get drunk. But when we was up at the volcano, to this day I wish I had been sober enough to remember what it looked like when I got up on that rim and looked down inside of a volcano. It had erupted the year before, but smoke and heat and everything was still coming out at the crater. And where that lava flow went across that mountain, it looked like wet mud out. It looked like where mud had slid. Was still new. We were on the Parker Ranch. That surprised everybody at that time. That Parker Ranch was the second largest cattle ranch in the country, in the world. And they had this Parker Ranch, and it was big because we had to hike down the mountain or the side of the hill to the beach. It was 14 miles down there. And when we'd leave the Parker Ranch headquarters where our camp was, it would look like around Snyder, Texas. It was bear grass, mesquite, and prickly pear, old red sand, just like Snyder, Texas. But in 3 hours marching downhill hill, you'd be in a tropical paradise down on the beach. And we would hike down there and eat, and then have to hike back up that hill in the daytime. And we was all glad to get away from Hawaii. But in the meantime, we were training for a night operation, and they would take us out in the afternoon, drag us out 12 or 15 miles. We'd ride out there on a ship, and then they'd put us in rubber boats, and we'd have to come back in on the radio beam in the rubber boats that night. All night you'd be in that water. And to this day, I don't like to go to the beach and get in the salt water. We were lucky enough that nobody got hurt there. But a lot of times when we were on maneuvers, especially when we were back before this operation, we were training for Tarawa, which was in New Zealand, and we had one boatload of sailors, Marines that got killed there one day because the sea was so rough that one boat got high enough and the swell broke in the water. The boat just fell right back in the one that was down below it. We had a lot of casualties. We lost lots of people in training. They were all combat related, but they were lost in training. Then after we got through with training in Hawaii, we went to the Mariana Islands. We landed on Saipan. That was the first island that we'd been on that had civilian population. And the Japanese soldiers, or their government at least, had convinced the soldiers that, the civilians, that they would be killed, that we would kill all of them. We'd either kill the men and rape the women and butcher the children, and they was too scared to do anything about it. They wouldn't surrender. They wouldn't come out. They would just live in them caves. And then them Jap soldiers would use the civilian population there to hide from, because they knew that the Americans wouldn't be shooting the women and kids. But sometimes it became an absolute necessity that you had to, and we did. But we lived through that. And then I went on to Tinian. But before that, it was on Saipan, while we were still taking Saipan. It was on 4th of July, 1944. We was laying on the side of a hill one day, about 100 and something degrees, and the grass about 3 foot tall. And we got pinned down with machine gun fire. And that grass, bullets was cutting that grass off above us about 18 inches up high. And somehow or another, I got hit. I don't know how a bullet hit me. They couldn't depress their machine guns down enough to hit right where we were. They were just shooting over us and hitting the ground behind us. But I got hit. I didn't get hurt, but I did get hit that was on the 4th of July, 1942. And then after that, we went to Tinian Island and taken Tinian. Tinian is the island they built the airstrip on that they blew the atomic bomb off of to tear up Japan, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki. It was pitiful, but it saved lots of lives. And then we came back to Saipan, and that's where I came home from. And that's what I had to go back and pick up because I missed it in my war years. Now I'll go back and pick up early part of my civilian years. I didn't drink anything. Then because I had made up my mind that I was going to quit when I got married. I made up my mind I was going to quit drinking alcohol because I couldn't make enough money to feed my family and drink alcohol at the same time. So I went many years without drinking, just many years. It wasn't easy, I have to admit, it wasn't easy to be without it, knowing what alcohol can do for you at the time you're drinking it. But when the time came for me to go back to drinking again, I was trying to do something, and things kept getting worse and worse. Everything kept getting worse. And one afternoon, that's before John got old enough to buy whiskey, he and another boy he graduated from high school with, I was riding with John. He had him in a pickup by then, and he wanted some whiskey, him and Bobby, the other lad. So I stopped, I bought them both a fifth. I got one Jack Daniels and one Wild Turkey. And I was riding along, I thought to myself, I said, old man, you just better sample that, see if it's good for them boys. Now, me, I hadn't had a drink for many, many years, and I hit that bottle pretty heavy, each one of the fifths. And by the time I got to the house, I was feeling no pain. And my wife, Eudora, needed some stuff from the store, so I was going to take her to the store. I take her to the store, all right, but I didn't bring her back. She brought me back. And then, for the next 14 years, I was out there sampling. I was out there sampling that alcohol. And I wanted to quit every day, but I couldn't figure out how in the world I could quit. I wanted to quit. I knew I'd quit. And in 1984, that was from 1970 to 1984, I was drinking pretty heavy, doing some pretty bad things. I never lost anything. I never lost any money. I never lost a job. I never lost a family. I never lost anything. The only thing that I lost me. And that is the greatest loss that any person can have when they lose their self. They don't really know who they are anymore. They have no idea who you are. And I wanted to quit, and one afternoon I was driving along. I was fixing to turn around and come back to the house. I had just stopped at one place and ate and bought some beer, 4 bottles. And as I was driving, I'd always drive and drink. As I was driving around drinking, I run in front of this car and I had this accident. And when they hit, I asked the person that was in the other car, nobody was hurt. I said, do you want to call the sheriff or do you want me to call? He said he'd call. His wife was driving, but he was right. He said he'd call. So when they came, I knew right then that I was going to go to jail. I called Eudora and said, I won't be home tonight because I had a little accident and I was drinking a little. I'll be going to jail tonight. And I knew something had to happen. And when that sheriff's deputy turned me around, pushed me up against the side of my truck, and put them handcuffs on me, I knew right then that that was what I had been looking for 14 years. I knew at that minute that I would never drink another drop as long as I lived. And he carried me to jail. They carried my pickup off to a pound somewhere over on Spring Cypress Road. But the last 4 beers I bought, one of them was still on the seat of the truck when I got out of jail, went and got my truck. And I've still got that beer sitting in right there now beside the television in the bookcase. It is a reminder to me that what beer will do for you. And I always tell the people that sees it that beer cost me $1,600. The full beers cost $1,600 or $400 a beer. And that was in 1984. And I have never had another drink since then. I don't even want to have a drink. And I'm going to tell you for sure what I have learned while I have been in this AA program all these 19 years, that people don't have to drink. I have learned that if you think about it, you don't have to do it just because. And you have to get over your resentments and all that stuff. You can't live with a resentment. You can't. You got to keep your ego in balance. Everything you do has to go in balance. And last spring, sometime early in the spring, one of the great-grandsons was being baptized, and I went to church. And I'm getting back into church again. I was in it years ago. I was baptized and saved way back there in the 70s or 60s or 70s. But I am back in it now, and I attend church every Sunday and every Wednesday. I don't take as much interest in it as I should, but since I am not capable physically of doing things that other people do, I am just in their way if I go to church and try to take part in what they do.